Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Welcome to my session called What's in a Name in this great Excel event, Excel Virtually Global 2024. I am young Karel Pieterse from the beautiful country of the Netherlands. I'm a self-employed Excel consultant with over 20 years of experience developing solutions in Excel, and I'm pleased to be presenting to you today. Range names are probably one of the oldest parts of Excel, apart from the grid and formulas that is. And in this session, I'll touch on the following subjects. I'll start with explaining what a named range is. Then I'll show you how you can define range names. There are many different ways. I'll show you how you use them. I'll talk about absolute and relative addressing in range names. I'll talk about the context of range names. I'll mention some special names that Excel manages. I will show you that you can use Excel for macro functions in names. I'll talk about lambdas. I'll explain a number of issues there are with range names, and last but not least, I'll show you a number of tools you can use to manage your names. So, what is a named range? You all know you can write formulas in Excel with a syntax like this: sum D18 colon D20. What a range name allows you to do is call these three cells apples. And then use that name in a formula. So that in just 30 seconds is what a range name is. Up next is how do we define range names. It is important to select the correct cells if you start defining names. This avoids having to input all of the information into the name box. For example, if we select the cells beneath pairs and then click the Define Name button, which you can find on the Formulas tab, Excel will automatically enter the name pairs into the name box for you. In addition, it will also have pre-entered the address of the cell selection. So all it takes now to define the name pairs is to click OK. Similarly, if you select a row of items and you click the Define Name button, Excel is going to pick up the value from the left of that, and it will define Europe with these cells. If you select a range like this, you can imagine it is hard for Excel to figure out what name you want to give to that range. So if I click Define Name now, the name box will be empty. So let's name this range Turnover. So that is one way of defining names by using the Define Name button, which you find on the Formulas tab of the ribbon. A different entry point to name your names is when you are in Name Manager already. You can then click the New button here, and it will open up the same dialog that you got when you click Define Name. Then yet another way is to click in the name box. We don't have a name for bananas yet, so I'll select the cells that I want to name bananas. I'll click in the name box and type bananas. You have to remember to press enter here, otherwise the name will not be defined. Alternatively, if a name already exists and I type in pairs, for example, it's going to select the cells pairs because that range name already exists. So you cannot use the name box to redefine a name to a different range of cells. The quickest way to define a lot of range names is by having a range which already has clear labels on the left and at the top. If we select the cells that include those labels and click the Create from Selection button on the ribbon, it will automatically suggest where to take the labels from. So Excel somehow recognizes that on the left and at the top row we have labels. If I now click OK, you will see that it has defined names for America, for apples, for Asia, for bananas, for Europe, for pears, and in addition, it also named the entire range with the label Turnover. So it was smart enough to recognize that we also have an intersection between the rows and the column labels that is relevant for these cells over here. Finally, of course, we can also use VBA to name ranges. Let me first get rid of the names that I just defined, just to make sure that my VBA works. So here's some VBA code that defines names. And the first statement that I want to show you is how we add a name to the active workbook. It uses the names.add method, and you tell it to use the name apples, and it tells it to use this formula in the range name refers to box. So let me F8 through this code. F8, go back to Excel, open up the name manager, Control F3, and here you go, apples has been named accordingly. Now let's go back to VBA and try the same for pears, but using a different syntax. Here we're just taking a range E18 to E20, that is these three cells, and name it pears, F8. And let's check that, Control F3, and you can see that pears has been added to the list and it rightfully refers to these cells. And finally, in VBA, we can also use the create name from selection statement, and it looks like this. If I now F8 through this statement and go back to Excel and Control F3 to open up Name Manager, you see that the same names that we saw earlier have all been defined. So America until pears, America, apples, Asia, bananas, Europe, and pears, but also turnover. So it works precisely the same as if you were using the user interface, which of course is what you would be expecting. So how do we use range names? Using range names is really easy. Suppose we want to have the sum of the number of apples sold in the past year here. I just start typing. I type sum, opening parentheses, and then because I know we have a range name, I just press the letter A and the P, and the IntelliSense automatically filters down to show me just the names that contain those letters and or start with those letters, to be more precise. And we have apples there. I can now hit the tab key, closing parentheses, and hit enter to get the sum of apples. If we want to create a data validation list, we can also refer to a list of items. So suppose we want the user to be able to choose from a list of companies, which I have prepared here on the list sheet. Here we have a table called table companies, and it has these cells. So let's try and implement that here. Go to data validation. I tell it I want to use a list, and then I'll just start typing. Or easier, I'll just select these three cells. And as you probably notice, Excel is now not using structured references. So it's not actually using the table syntax. TBL companies, opening bracket, companies, closing bracket. Rather, it's just using a regular cell address. So if I now click OK, the drop down here works. I get the alpha, beta, and gamma company names here. But look what happens if I add a delta company. As expected, automatically Excel extends the table, and you would expect that we can now select delta as well here. But as you can see, that does not work. So what I always do to circumvent that issue is I'm just going to select the cells that I want to use in my data validation and name them. So I'm going to Control Alt F3 to open up the define name box. And I'm going to name these cells list.companies. Let me fix the typo here and click OK. And now I'm going to use that new name in my data validation here, and of course I don't want to type this, I'll just hit the F3 function button here, scroll down to list.companies and click OK, and click OK again. Now we should correctly see Delta appear, and if we now add the Echo company, we should see Echo appear in our list here automatically. And that is because we use a range name that is pointing to this table column. And maybe you've noticed that the range name actually does allow you to use structured references. In fact, it did so automatically. Now let's talk about absolute and relative addressing in range names. If you look at Name Manager, you notice that all range names have absolute cell addresses. That is the default. But what you can do is you can also define relative range names. So let me define one. Control Alt F3 to open the name box. And this works precisely the same as with any formula. You use the F4 function key to toggle the absolute and relative addresses. So let me define this one. If I now use sum, it already tells me which cells it's going to add, which is great. And interestingly enough, if I now type the same formula here, you see that it's working relative now. So it's taking the 3 cells above the place where I write my formula. And to prove that to you, if I move to somewhere completely different and type sum, it keeps highlighting the 3 cells immediately above the position where my formula is. So that is how relative references in names work. They work relative to the position where your cell selector is when you define the name. To prove that, if I now open Name Manager here, you'll see that the address that this relative name refers to is E71 to E73. If I move my cell cursor to column A, cell 18, and then open Name Manager, you'll see that the address has changed. So if you have relative names, and I highly recommend you not to use them, you must always make sure that you are on the correct cell when you start editing that name. Right, let's talk about the context of names. If you look at this worksheet here, it looks as if we're adding the total of apples beneath there, and the formula in the cell says sum apples, but notice how the 3 cells above this sum formula are not highlighted, and that is because the range name apples actually points to a different range. I can hit F5 here and see that apples actually refers to the apples on the how to define worksheet rather than to the context worksheet that we have here. So what many people don't realize is that you can actually define a range name that pertains to a specific worksheet. So let's define a name apples that is scoped to the context worksheet. Formulas tab, define name, or Control Alt F3. So we're defining apples and we're scoping it to the context worksheet. And let's add a comment to that name. And now, of course, we need apples defined as these 3 cells. And let's click OK. Have a look at cell D21 while I click OK. It doubles its value because these are actually the right numbers, and it's now summing these cells, which is indicated by if I hit F2, it will correctly highlight these cells. Now let me also demonstrate why adding a comment to a name might be useful. If I type apples, it shows us that there are now two names to choose from. one at the workbook level and one at the worksheet level. And if I arrow down to the worksheet level, notice how it displays that comment that we just typed. It helps to indicate to the user what a name is about. So this is a bit weird. If I type apples here, Excel indicates Apple's workbook and worksheet. But if I use the drop down arrow keys, the formula doesn't change. It's only after I hit the tab key that the formula changes. So for example, if I hit the tab key here, it prepends apples with the worksheet name, whereas if I select this one, it prepends it with the workbook name, followed by an exclamation mark. But what is kind of confusing is if I just type apples and hit enter, even though Apple's workbook is highlighted, it in fact uses the locally scoped name, which is proven by if I hit F2, it will show you that this range is highlighted. So if you have a duplicate, a range name that is both present as a globally scoped range name and as a locally scoped range name, beware, because you might be using the wrong range name than the one that you're expecting to use. Now it's time to talk about special names. Those are range names that are managed by Excel. I prepared a special workbook for that so as not to mess up the workbook that I've been presenting from so far. Let me select that. I've made some preparations in this version of this tab by adding some stuff below. So I've added a table which has a table slicer. I've also added a pivot table which has a timeline slicer. And then I used the legacy text import wizard to import some bogus PayPal data into this workbook. So which special names do we have? If you enter a let formula like this one, Excel will add a range name. You don't see that range name here, but if we open my Name Manager app, which we'll discuss later, and you select the Excel names section, you'll see that there is an xlpm.x range name defined here. So if you use parameters in the let function, each of them is going to be added as a hidden range name managed by Excel. On top of that, if you use any of the new functions, and those are functions that have been added since Excel 2007, Excel will add a range name for those as well. So here you see a couple of examples: the if-error function, the Lambda function, the let function, and the sequent function. Apparently, I've been trying those out in this workbook. They're no longer in this workbook, so you can see Excel has left behind those range names in this file. Another thing that adds range names is the autofilter dropdown. Autofilter again is one of those hidden Excel names, and it is displayed as the range name underscore filter database, which is a range name that is defined local to the worksheet. So each worksheet can have one autofilter and is managed by a range name called underscore filter database, locally scoped to that sheet. In addition, if you define a custom view, which is accessible through the View Custom Views button over here, Excel starts adding range names which end with period WVU period filter data. In addition, if you access the page layout tab and set a print area for the worksheet, Excel will add a print underscore area range name that is local to this tab as well, and that's a visible name. And if you set print titles like I did for this sheet, print titles, it's going to add a print titles range name, and it shows you both print titles ranges that I set by clicking the print titles button. So as you can see, I have a row 1 fixed that is reflected by this, and I have column A set, which is reflected by the first part. So that's print area and print titles. Then you might also encounter range names that are caused by a deprecated add-in called Report Manager. And last but not least, we have range names for slicers, namely the slicer table for slicer name, which is the name for this slicer here. If you right click it and select slicer settings, you will see that the name for this slicer is table for slicer, and the name that you use for formulas is slicer underscore table for slicers. Just exactly what you see here. And then the timeline slicer. Um, and apparently that is prepended by native timeline underscore time. So the time is the actual column that we're slicing using this timeline slicer. Right, so let's do Excel for macro functions. Decades ago, Excel version 4 did not contain VBA. You automated Excel 4 by using dedicated macro functions. As you see here, the old help files that come with those macro functions are still here. What many people don't know is that you can use those Excel 4 macro functions in a defined name to use them. To be able to do so, you have to save your workbook as an Excel macro containing workbook, by the way. So let's create an example here. The files Excel 4 macro function is one of those that you can use. And I'll open up the define name box and type in file list. No, let's name it list of files. And then I'll enter the files function, and the files function has one argument, and that is the file filter, which I have already prepared in cell D21. And if I click OK, then now that function has been defined, and as you can see, it quickly picks up the files that are in my Excel Virtually Global 2024 directory. The list of files name does not spill automatically, so if I click enter, I only get the first entry. So to get the list of all the files, you actually need to use the index function to get them. So index list of files sequence, how many rows? Let's just pick 100 rows. And now you get a list of files. And it will give you a res for the ones that are, because I have less files than the 100 that I specified. There's a bunch of interesting stuff that you might do with the XLM functions, and I encourage you to read through this help file to see which there are available. If you go to my website and look for the names article, I have a couple of examples there as well. Having discussed XLM names, it's now time to discuss Lambda names. And I'll jump right in with an example. A formula people sometimes need is a way to get the name of your worksheet tab in a cell by using a function. And this is usually done by using the cell function in the example as shown here in the currently active cell. And what people do is they parse the result to get the sheet name, which is at the end. And it's done so by, and that's done by using this horrendous formula. And that became simpler once Microsoft introduced the let function, because that makes it easier to avoid having to repeat blocks of calculations in a formula. In this case, I'm repeating the cell file name A1 by naming it F, so I can reuse that in the rest of the formula. And then some time ago, Microsoft introduced the Lambda function, which you can wrap around such a let function or any other function, and that allows you to pass an argument to a name. So let's take this part of this lambda and copy it, Control C, and I'll now open the define name box, and let me call this sheet name and paste in that formula right here. What you should now be able to do is pass that cell address to this sheet name function, and it will give you the same lambda result. And as you can see, this is by far the most readable function that gets the name of the sheet into a cell. Of course, there's loads of other stuff that you can do with the lambda function, and there's a couple of examples here. Names also have some issues, and let me just mention a couple of them. The first one I wanted to demonstrate is what happens if you have a range name that exists both locally and globally, like the apple's name that is defined as a workbook level name here, which I call global, and a worksheet level name here on the context worksheet. So let's go to the context worksheet and select it. Now suppose you're using VBA to change the definition of a name. So let's take a look at this little routine here. The first step, what it does is it sets a variable to the range name apples, and because it prepends the names collection with this workbook, you would expect that we're addressing the globally defined name apples. Then we'll show a message box with the formula that belongs to the apples, and finally we're going to delete that range name. Now if we go back to name manager and we look at the definition, the workbook level name apples points to the how to define worksheet, whereas the locally defined apples points to the context worksheet. So what we're expecting is this name to be deleted. So let me run this. I F5 on this, and as you can see, the formula that it thinks belongs to that name is actually the same as the one that's highlighted in my name manager here. So if I now click OK, you would expect this name to disappear as soon as I click refresh. So let me click OK, click refresh, and lo and behold, the workbook level name is still there, but what has disappeared is the name pointing to the context sheet. Let's try this again, but this time we select a different worksheet. So I'm going to redefine that local name. Control Alt F3, apples, pointing to the scoping to the context sheet. Click OK, click refresh. There your apples name is back again. Now just select any other worksheet and go back to the VBA editor and run that same code again. It still correctly displays the refers to formula of the globally defined apples name. And this time it should have removed the global workbook name indeed, and the locally defined apples name is still there. So if you have a duplicate, both locally and globally defined, beware if you're writing VBA code that addresses either of those names. It makes a difference which worksheet is selected. If the worksheet that contains the locally defined name is the active sheet, you are addressing the globally defined name when you're doing stuff like deleting it. Another issue is one with a special type of range name. And let me open up the name manager here to show you. And that is a name that I defined just now. I called it exclamation name, and it uses a syntax where the sheet name is deliberately omitted from the refers to formula. And what that does is it makes the name relative to the worksheet where you use it. So I typed exclamation name here in a formula, and it picks up the value from cell A1 of this worksheet. And I did the same on sheet 2. And as you can see, exclamation name picks up the name from cell A1 on sheet 2 in this cell. And the same happens in sheet 3. There is an issue, however. And that issue is, look what happens if I cause a calculation by some VBA code. Now look what happens if I let VBA trigger a real calculation of Excel. I have a macro prepared for that, so I'll just Alt F8 and run the calc now macro. Click run. And nothing appears to change here, but if you look at sheet 2 and sheet 1, you now notice that all A3 cells contain the same value sheet 3. Let me try that here again. Alt F8, run calc now. Now this changes to sheet 1, but sheet 2 and sheet 3 also contain sheet 1 in cell A3. So that means that if you let VBA do a recalculation, all range names that contain that exclamation mark syntax recalculate as if they're on the active sheet. Another issue with range names is what spreadsheet auditors complain about, and that is that it is not really easy to see where a formula is taking its values from if the formula refers to range names. There's nothing in this formula that tells you that pairs are actually cells that are on a different worksheet. I know that if you know your shortcut key, you can hit the F5 key, and that will tell you that pairs is actually represented by cells E18 to E20 on the how to define sheet. So that's one of the things that auditors complain about. Using range names can make it harder to find out what a formula is using. And the final thing I wanted to warn you about is that range names have a tendency to duplicate themselves. For example, if you look at all these range names, they all point to a worksheet called How to Define. So let's go to that How to Define worksheet and create a copy of that worksheet. So just Control drag the tab, that makes a copy, and then refresh this range name list. It duplicates all the range names. So all of the range names that were pointing to the How to Define sheet are now duplicated as local names to the How to Define opening bracket through closing bracket sheet. And of course Excel does that to make it unambiguous which cells the range name is using, because, well, I mean, you have names pointing to these cells and now you make a copy of that sheet. So if you use the name pairs here, you're actually addressing the locally defined range name like I showed earlier. So the final subject that contains actual content in this session is about name manager. And I know of 3 flavors, 4 of them. Of course, Excel has the built-in name manager, which you access by clicking on the name manager button here or pressing Control F3. While this offers most of the functionality that people need, it is a bit limited in functionality. For example, if you look at the number of filters that there are, it is relatively limited. So that's why me and a fellow MVP called Charles Williams created a tool called Name Manager over 20 years ago. Actually, the rumor has it that this button Name Manager was named after our Name Manager add-in. So if I go to that page on my website, which is accessible through the Downloads Name Manager button, here you'll find a link to download the file. And this is a regular VBA add-in. So if you click this link, it will download a zip file to wherever you save it. And your first action that you need to take is save that zip file and unzip it to a folder where you want that add-in file to reside. If you've done so, there's an additional couple of buttons here on the Formulas tab, and the group name is called Name Manager Plus. And the button to launch the Name Manager main window is this one. And as you can see, this version of Name Manager just shows you all of the names except for the ones that you set in settings to not show. So in settings, for example, you can check or uncheck the show Excel system names to hide them from view. So in this case, I've checked the box to show them, and now you can see that all of the system names are also there, except for the ones that we showed earlier in the presentation about print titles and everything, because this is an older version of the file without print titles and everything. So this version of Name Manager comes with a truckload of different filters and everything. For example, you can ask it to show just the globally defined range names. I'm not right, or any names local to any sheet. Or you can also ask it to maybe show all range names that are hidden, or range names that are visible, of course. And then there's a load of other actions here as well, like Lambda names, of which there's only one, called sheet name. And then you have duplicate global local name selection, so that it tells you which range names you need to be careful with because they are duplicated in the file. So that's my VBA version of Name Manager. And about a year ago, I launched a Office JavaScript kind of duplication of that Name Manager, which you access from my website through this link, which is actually available if you scroll down here and click on this link here that says where it says Excel Online version. It also works on desktop Excel, and I think the bigger advantage of this one is that it opens up in a task pane and is slightly easier to use, simpler to use, probably a better phrase. The site comes with this install button. If you click that, it will automatically install this on your Excel Online. If you prefer to use it on desktop Excel, you can click this button and it will install it on your Excel desktop. So I've done that here, of course, and you've seen me use this already. You can create it, you can make this a bit wider to see what the range names are. And as you can see, the number of filters that we have here is slightly less and as you can see, the number of filters we have available is a bit less than on the VBA version of Name Manager. Right, and then finally, last but probably not least, there is what's called the Excel Labs Advanced Formula Environment. And that is especially useful if you are creating Lambda names a lot. So where do you find that one? It is if you go to the Home tab and click on Add-ins and you search for Excel Labs. Install this one. I've already done so, so I'll just click the button that belongs to it. It takes a while to load because there's a lot in there. And I'll just open up the Advanced Formula environment. You can tell it to open that environment by default. So let's just click Open here. And this one allows you to check what names there are in your file and what names are pointing to the grid. Strange enough, it's not showing any of the range names. This kind of shows that I never used the Advanced Formula environment, but it does show us the Lambda name that I created earlier on. So that brings me to this sheet where I would give the floor to you guys to ask questions. And while we're answering the questions, for those of you that get bored about the questions, please go ahead and fill out the evaluation. Tell us what you liked and what you didn't like about my session. And finally, the Excel team of Microsoft is seeking for research participants. So if you'd like to spend some time trying to make Excel a better product, scan this QR code and fill out the form, and maybe they'll invite you